Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're diving into something different. Something that sounds simple on the surface, but is actually one of the most dramatic, desperate, and darkly fascinating chapters in medical history. We're talking about penicillin. And no, this isn't your high school biology lecture. This is the real story. The one with urine recycling, boiling injections, moldy cantaloupes, and scientists literally wearing their experiments in their coat linings while crossing the Atlantic during wartime. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep dives into history's strangest corners, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more content like this. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing the global community we've built here. Now, get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. Grab a drink. Let that background noise settle in. Because for the next couple of hours, we're going back to a time when a simple cut could kill you. When infections were death sentences. And when a handful of scientists fought against impossible odds to create something that would save more lives than almost any other invention in human history. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The patient whose life was recycled. Picture this. It's 1941. You are lying in a hospital bed in Oxford, England. Your name is Albert Alexander, and you are a police constable. A few weeks ago, you scratched your face on a rose thorn while gardening. Just a scratch. Nothing serious. Except it got infected. And that infection spread. And now, you are dying. Your face is swollen beyond recognition. Abscesses have formed across your scalp. Your eyes are nearly swollen shut. You are developing sepsis. Blood poisoning that is slowly shutting down your organs, one by one. The doctors have tried everything. Sulfa drugs, surgical drainage, bed rest, prayer. Nothing is working. You are 43 years old. And everyone in that hospital knows you have maybe days left, hours, if you're unlucky. But then, something extraordinary happens, something unprecedented in medical history. A team of researchers from Oxford University, led by a pathologist named Howard Florey and a biochemist named Ernst Boris Chain, have been working on something experimental, something unproven. A substance extracted from mold that, in their laboratory tests, seems to kill bacteria. They call it penicillin. They've been trying for years to purify enough of it to treat a human being, and finally, just barely, they have enough for one patient, one trial. One chance to see if this strange substance from fungus can actually save a human life. Albert Alexander becomes patient number 1. On February 12, 1941, they inject him with penicillin, and almost immediately, something miraculous happens. His fever drops. The swelling begins to recede. The abscesses start to drain and heal. Within 24 hours, he is eating again. Within days, he is sitting up, talking, laughing with nurses. The man who was on death's doorstep is coming back to life. The researchers are ecstatic. It's working. Penicillin actually works in humans. But here is where the story takes a dark turn. They don't have enough. The global supply of purified penicillin in 1941 is so microscopic, so precious, that even treating one man completely is impossible. The Oxford team had scraped together everything they had, every last microgram of the drug, and it still wasn't enough for a full course of treatment. So they do something desperate, something that sounds insane by today's standards. They collect Albert Alexander's urine. You see, the early forms of penicillin were so poorly absorbed by the body that 60 to 80% of it was excreted unchanged in the urine. The same molecules that were injected into Alexander's veins were coming out in his bladder, still active, still usable. So the research team set up a bizarre recycling operation. They collected his urine, ran it through adsorption columns to extract the penicillin, purified it as best they could, and injected the same molecules back into his body. They were literally recycling his own medicine back into his veins. This went on for days. Urine collected, penicillin extracted, re-injected. The same precious molecules cycling through his body again and again. It was grotesque. It was desperate. And it was working. For 5 days, Albert Alexander improved. The infection retreated. Color returned to his face. He spoke of going home, of returning to his duties as a constable. The miracle was real. And then they ran out. Despite all their efforts, despite collecting every drop of urine and extracting every trace of the drug, the supply finally, inevitably, ran dry. There was simply no more penicillin left in the entire world to give him. Without the drug, the infection returned. Fast, furious, unstoppable. Within days, all the progress reversed. The swelling came back. The fever spiked. The abscesses reopened. And on March 15th, 1941, just 1 month after receiving the first injection of penicillin, Albert Alexander died. But here is what haunts this story. He didn't die because penicillin failed. He died because humanity hadn't yet figured out how to make enough of it. The drug worked. The science was sound. The miracle was real. There just wasn't enough miracle to go around. Albert Alexander's death was both a tragedy and a catalyst. His case proved beyond doubt that penicillin could save human lives. But it also made brutally clear that until someone figured out how to mass-produce this substance, countless people would die from infections that could have been cured. His recycled treatment, as desperate and disturbing as it sounds, was a turning point. It showed researchers exactly how much drug was needed for a complete cure. It demonstrated that penicillin was safe enough for repeated dosing, and it lit a fire under everyone involved to find a way to make more of this miracle substance. Albert Alexander's name isn't famous. Most people have never heard of him. But he was the first human being ever saved, even temporarily, by an antibiotic. The first person to experience what billions of us now take for granted, the ability to survive a bacterial infection with a simple injection. He lived just long enough to prove that the impossible was possible. And then, he became the martyr whose death would save millions. Chapter 2. Injections that felt like fire. So penicillin works. That's been established. But there is a problem. Actually, several problems. And one of them is going to make you grateful you weren't born in the 1940s. Early penicillin was, to put it mildly, disgusting. We're not talking about the clean, clear, carefully manufactured antibiotics you get at the pharmacy today. We're talking about a crude, impure, contaminated liquid that looked like pond water and felt like liquid hell when it entered your body. Imagine you are a patient in 1942. You are desperately ill with an infection. The doctors tell you they have something experimental that might save your life. You are terrified, but you are also dying, so you agree. They bring out a syringe, a thick needle, the kind that would make modern patients faint just looking at it, and they fill it with a dark yellow liquid, cloudy, full of visible particles, sometimes even brownish. The injection site is your buttocks. They have to use a large muscle because they need to inject huge volumes of this impure solution, sometimes 10, 20, even 30 milliliters at once. That is like injecting several tablespoons of liquid directly into your muscle tissue. The needle goes in, and then the pain starts. Patients described it as feeling like boiling water was being pumped into their muscles, like acid, like fire spreading under their skin. Some screamed, some passed out, some begged the doctors to stop. Infection or no infection. But why did it hurt so much? Because the early penicillin wasn't pure. It was maybe 10 to 20% penicillin at best. The rest was a toxic soup of bacterial byproducts, fungal proteins, culture medium residue, and chemical contaminants from the crude extraction process. The pH was all over the place. Some batches were too acidic, others too alkaline. Each one burned differently, but they all burned. The Oxford team and later the early pharmaceutical manufacturers were working with improvised equipment, glass tubing, beakers, anything they could sterilize. There were no standardized protocols. Every batch was slightly different. Some were worse than others, and the patients had no choice but to endure it. The injection sites would swell, turn red. They become hot to the touch. Abscesses sometimes formed at the injection sites themselves, creating new infections from the very treatment meant to cure them. Patients limped for days afterward, unable to sit or lie down comfortably. One nurse from the era described having to rotate injection sites carefully because patients would have such severe muscle damage that they couldn't receive multiple injections in the same area. She said some patients looked like they'd been beaten, their buttocks and thighs covered in angry welts and bruises. Children were worse. They didn't understand why the doctors were hurting them. They screamed. They fought. Parents had to hold them down while nurses injected the burning liquid into their small bodies. And yet, people lined up for it. Because here is the thing. As much as it hurt, as much as patients dreaded each injection, they knew the alternative. The alternative was death. Slow, agonizing death from infections that rotted flesh, boiled blood, and shut down organs. So they chose the fire in their muscles over the fire in their veins. Desperate patients would show up at hospitals begging for penicillin, even knowing about the pain. Word had spread about this miracle drug, this thing from mold that could cure the incurable. And people were willing to suffer temporary agony for the chance at permanent survival. Doctors and nurses administering these injections often felt like torturers. They knew they were inflicting genuine suffering, but they also knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. Patients who would have died horrible deaths were walking out of hospitals alive. One doctor from the period wrote in his journal that giving penicillin injections felt like participating in both miracle and torture simultaneously. He described watching a child sob through an injection, then watching that same child playing in the hospital hallway 3 days later. Infection gone, life saved. The pain was temporary. Death was forever. As manufacturing improved through the mid-1940s, the purity increased. By 1945, pharmaceutical companies had figured out better extraction methods, better purification techniques. The yellow liquid became clearer. The injections became less excruciating. But those early patients, the ones who endured the boiling water injections, they were pioneers, guinea pigs in the most literal sense. Their suffering helped researchers understand what needed to be improved, what could be tolerated, what crossed the line from treatment to torture. By the 1950s, penicillin injections were relatively painless. By the 60s, they were routine, but for a brief window in history, with getting the life-saving drug meant volunteering for an experience that felt like your muscles were melting from the inside. And thousands of people did it anyway, because survival, even painful survival, beats the alternative every single time. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Became a Symbol. Let's jump across the Atlantic. It is March 1942. New Haven, Connecticut. Yale New Haven Hospital. A 33-year-old woman named Ann Miller is dying. She had suffered a miscarriage a few weeks earlier. A tragedy, but not uncommon for the time. Except something went wrong. An infection set in. Streptococcal bacteria entered her bloodstream. And now she has streptococcal septicemia, blood poisoning. Her temperature is hovering around 106 degrees Fahrenheit. She is delirious, drifting in and out of consciousness. Her husband sits by her bedside, helpless. The doctors have tried everything in their arsenal: sulfa drugs, blood transfusions, fever management, surgical intervention. Nothing is working. The bacteria are winning. Her doctors give her days, maybe hours. They have seen this before. Once streptococcal septicemia takes hold, it is almost always fatal. They have prepared her family for the inevitable. But then, her physician, Dr. John Bumstead, remembers something. He had heard rumors about an experimental drug being developed, something from a pharmaceutical company called Merck, something called penicillin. He makes a desperate phone call. At this point, penicillin is so scarce in the United States that it is literally under military control. The U.S. government has classified it as a strategic wartime resource. Every gram produced is earmarked for military testing and eventual use on wounded soldiers. But Dr. Bumstead pleads his case. This is a young woman, a civilian, dying from an infection that this drug might cure. Could they spare just a small amount, enough for one patient? After frantic calls up the chain of command, somehow, miraculously, permission is granted. A small emergency supply of penicillin is diverted from military stockpiles and rushed to New Haven. On March 14, 1942, they begin infusing Ann Miller with penicillin. The change is almost immediate, almost supernatural. Within hours, her fever begins to drop. Within 24 hours, she is lucid, talking, asking for food. Within 48 hours, she is sitting up in bed. Within a week, she is out of danger. The woman who was essentially waiting to die is now planning to go home. The medical staff is stunned. They have never seen anything like this. Infections don't just vanish. Dying patients don't just suddenly get better. This is impossible. Except it is happening. News of Ann Miller's recovery spreads like wildfire through the medical community. If penicillin could save her, if people, someone with full-blown streptococcal septicemia, a condition that was essentially a death sentence, then what else could it cure? The press gets hold of the story. Miracle drug saves dying woman, reads one headline. Ann Miller becomes the face of penicillin in America. She is interviewed. Her photo appears in newspapers. She becomes, quite literally, the poster child for this new era of medicine. But her case does something even more important. It gets the attention of government officials and military planners. Up until this point, penicillin had been an interesting curiosity, a promising experimental treatment, but Ann Miller's case made it real. It showed definitively that penicillin could save civilian lives with dramatic, undeniable effectiveness. Within weeks of her recovery, the U.S. government reclassified penicillin research as a top national priority. Funding poured in. Pharmaceutical companies were given contracts to scale up production. The War Production Board coordinated efforts across multiple companies to solve the manufacturing challenges. Penicillin went from laboratory experiment to national emergency project almost overnight. Some historians argue that Ann Miller's recovery was the single most important case in penicillin's history because it transformed public and governmental perception of the drug. It wasn't just that she survived. It was that she survived so dramatically, so visibly, at exactly the right moment when decision makers needed to be convinced. Ann Miller herself lived a long life after her brush with death. She became an advocate for medical research, speaking about her experience. She lived to see penicillin become common, then ubiquitous, then taken for granted. She died in 1999 at the age of 90, having lived 57 years beyond the point when she should have died in 1942. Every birthday she celebrated, every milestone she reached, every moment of life she experienced after March 1942 was a gift from mold. And every person saved by antibiotics since then owes a debt to the decision made in a desperate moment to divert a tiny amount of penicillin to save one woman in Connecticut. Ann Miller didn't just survive. She changed history by surviving at exactly the right moment, in front of exactly the right people. Sometimes, one life really can shift the course of everything that follows. Chapter 4: Brewing Miracles in the Strangest Places. So, we have established that penicillin works. We have established that people desperately need it. Now comes the practical question. How do you actually make this stuff? And the answer, at least in the early 1940s, is anywhere you can find a container and a prayer. Let me paint you a picture of the Oxford laboratory where penicillin was first produced. Forget gleaming stainless steel. Forget computerized fermentation tanks. Forget anything that resembles a modern pharmaceutical facility. We are talking about a makeshift operation in the basement of the Oxford University Pathology Department. And the equipment? Whatever they could scrounge up. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain needed vessels to grow the Penicillium mold. Lots of vessels. Because here is the problem. One flask of mold culture produced almost nothing. A tiny, microscopic amount of penicillin. To get enough drug to treat even one patient like Albert Alexander, they needed gallons upon gallons of culture. Hundreds of containers, all growing mold simultaneously. But this was wartime Britain. Resources were scarce. Money was tight. Specialized laboratory equipment was impossible to obtain. So, they improvised. They used bedpans, hospital bedpans, sterilized and repurposed as culture vessels. They used ceramic milk churns, the kind dairy farmers used before refrigeration became common. They used biscuit tins, metal containers that once held cookies, now filled with mold broth. They used pie dishes, casserole pans, anything flat and wide that could maximize surface area for mold growth. One famous story tells of them using old bathtubs, laying them out in rows, filling them with culture medium, and growing vast sheets of penicillium across the surface. Picture this scene: a basement laboratory that smells like a combination of wet basement, rotting fruit, and fermentation. Rows and rows of mismatched containers, each one covered with a fuzzy layer of greenish-blue mold. Culture medium that looks and smells like spoiled soup. The researchers nicknamed their lab the Mold Room, and colleagues joked that they could smell it from down the hall. The fermentation process produced such a foul odor that people complained, but Florey and Chain didn't care. They were too busy trying to extract miracle from rot. The process was painstaking. Each container had to be monitored. The mold had to grow at the right temperature, with the right oxygen levels, for the right amount of time. Too soon, and there wasn't enough penicillin. Too late, and the culture died or got contaminated. When the cultures were ready, the team would harvest them. This meant filtering out all the mold and bacterial debris, leaving behind a brownish liquid that might contain penicillin. Then came the extraction process. They used crude chemical techniques, things they had adapted from other fields. They would add solvents, adjust pH, freeze dry, recrystallize. Each step was an experiment. Nothing was standardized. And from gallons of foul-smelling broth, they would get maybe a speck of actual penicillin, sometimes an amount about the size of a fingernail. From gallons of liquid, that fingernail-sized amount was barely enough to treat one infection for one day. And they needed to treat infections that lasted weeks. Do the math. It is horrifying. The inefficiency was staggering. The waste was enormous, but it was all they had. Graduate students and lab assistants worked around the clock in shifts. Someone always had to be monitoring the cultures, maintaining temperatures, checking for contamination. They slept in the lab. They ate meals surrounded by mold. One researcher later recalled that they stopped noticing the smell after a while. It just became part of their existence. They would go home, and their spouses would complain that they smelled like fermentation, but they couldn't smell it on themselves anymore. The lab looked like something between a chemistry experiment and a witch's brewery, makeshift, chaotic, held together with improvisation and desperation. But from that chaos came something extraordinary. Those bedpans, milk churns, and bathtubs were the bridge between Fleming's Petri dish observation in 1929 and the global antibiotic revolution of the 1950s. Without those improvised vessels, without the researchers willing to turn any container into a mold farm, penicillin might have remained a laboratory curiosity. Instead, they brewed miracles in the strangest places imaginable and proved that sometimes world-changing science doesn't need fancy equipment. It just needs determination, creativity, and a willingness to work with whatever you have. Even if what you have is a bathtub full of mold in a basement that smells like death. Chapter 5. The Woman Who Found Gold in Mold. Let's shift to Peoria, Illinois, 1943. The U.S. Department of Agriculture operates a research facility here, the Northern Regional Research Laboratory. By this point, American pharmaceutical companies are racing to mass-produce penicillin. The British have proven it works. The U.S. government has made it a priority. But there is still a massive problem. Fleming's original Penicillium notatum strain, the one that contaminated his Petri dish back in 1929, the one the Oxford team used for their early work, is a terrible producer. It makes penicillin, yes, but in frustratingly tiny amounts. If penicillin is ever going to be mass-produced, if it is ever going to save soldiers on battlefields and civilians in hospitals, they need a better strain, a mold that produces more penicillin, faster, in larger quantities. So the Peoria lab launches a program they call Search for Better Molds. The idea is simple. Penicillium molds are everywhere. They grow on fruit, bread, soil, anywhere organic material decays. Somewhere out there, statistically, there has to be a strain that produces more penicillin than Fleming's original. They just need to find it. Enter Mary Hunt. Mary Hunt is a bacteriologist working at the Peoria lab. She is highly educated, extremely competent, and largely ignored by her male colleagues in the way professional women often were in the 1940s. Her assignment is to collect mold samples from the local area, go to markets, check fruit, bring back anything that looks promising, test it in the lab to see if it produces penicillin. It is tedious work. Sample after sample produces nothing useful. Most molds don't produce penicillin at all. Those that do produce it in amounts no better than the original strain. But Mary Hunt is persistent, methodical. She visits grocery stores, farmers markets, anywhere food is sold. She inspects produce with the eye of someone looking for decay, for that telltale fuzzy growth. And then, one day, she finds it. In a local Peoria grocery store, she notices a cantaloupe, a golden yellow cantaloupe, beautiful to look at, except it is spotted with mold. Most people would throw it away. Mary Hunt buys it. She brings it back to the lab. She carefully cultures the mold growing on its surface. She isolates the strain, grows it, tests it, and this strain, which they designate Penicillium chrysogenum, produces penicillin, a lot of penicillin. Not just a little more than Fleming's strain, many times more, orders of magnitude more. This is the breakthrough everyone has been looking for. The Peoria team immediately begins working with this new strain. They optimize growing conditions. They use newly developed deep tank fermentation methods, technology borrowed from the beer brewing industry. They push the strain to its limits, and it performs beautifully. Within months, this cantaloupe strain becomes the foundation of industrial penicillin production. Pharmaceutical companies adopt it. Fermentation tanks replace bedpans and milk churns. Production scales from fingernail-sized amounts to kilograms, then tons. This single moldy cantaloupe from a Peoria grocery store becomes the genetic ancestor of almost all penicillin produced for the next several decades. Mary Hunt's colleagues, being the professional and mature scientists they are, give her a nickname. They call her Moldy Mary. It is said partly with affection and partly with condescension. She is the woman who brings in moldy fruit. Ha ha, very funny. But Mary Hunt has the last laugh. Because her moldy cantaloupe, her persistence in collecting samples, her careful scientific methodology, all of it contributes to one of the most important medical breakthroughs of the 20th century. By 1944, penicillin production in the United States has increased by a factor of thousands. By 1945, there is enough penicillin to treat not just military casualties, but civilians as well. How many lives did Mary Hunt's cantaloupe save? Impossible to calculate. Millions, certainly. Possibly tens of millions over the decades since. Soldiers who survived battlefield wounds, children who survived ear infections, mothers who survived childbirth complications, ordinary people with ordinary infections who lived instead of died. All because one woman in Illinois wouldn't stop looking at moldy fruit. The irony is that Mary Hunt's name is hardly known outside of pharmaceutical history circles. She never became famous. She didn't win major awards. She didn't become wealthy from her discovery. She was a woman scientist in the 1940s, which meant her contributions were often overlooked or minimized. The men who developed the fermentation processes got more credit. The company executives got more recognition. But the people who know the history, who study the development of antibiotics, they know the truth. Moldy Mary found gold in a cantaloupe. And that discovery, that one sample from one piece of fruit, helped save more lives than many famous generals, politicians, or military strategists of World War II. She didn't command armies. She didn't sign treaties. She didn't make speeches. She just kept looking at moldy fruit until she found the right one and changed the world. Chapter 6. The Secret Crossing. War is raging across Europe. Britain is under bombardment. German U-boats patrol the Atlantic, hunting Allied ships. The threat of invasion is real. In this chaos, two British scientists prepare for one of the most important and dangerous journeys of the war. Howard Florey and Norman Heatley are about to fly from Britain to the United States. Their mission is to convince American pharmaceutical companies and researchers to help scale up penicillin production. Britain is too busy surviving to manufacture penicillin in the quantities needed. The infrastructure isn't there. The resources aren't available. America, still officially neutral at this point, but clearly leaning toward the Allies, has the industrial capacity to mass-produce penicillin. But first, American researchers need access to the technology, the methods, and most crucially, the mold strains. Flory and Heatley pack up their research notes. They prepare samples of their best Penicillium cultures, and then they face a terrifying question. What if their plane crashes? What if it is shot down? What if they are captured? If they lose their mold samples, 14 years of work are lost. The strains they have carefully cultivated, the ones that produce the most penicillin, the ones they have optimized through countless experiments, all gone. And they can't simply mail duplicates ahead. This is wartime. Nothing is secure. Mail can be lost, intercepted, or delayed indefinitely. They need a backup plan, something that guarantees at least some spores will make it to America, even if everything else is lost. So they make a decision that sounds like something from a spy novel. They smear penicillium spores into their clothes, not just carrying them, actually rubbing the spores into the fabric of their coat linings, their pockets, their personal items. The idea is that spores are hardy. They can survive dormant for long periods. If the worst happens, if they crash, if their luggage is lost, if everything goes wrong, at least their clothes will carry living spores. Someone could, theoretically, scrape their coat lining and recover viable penicillium. It sounds absurd. It sounds desperate. It was both. But it is also exactly the kind of pragmatic, slightly paranoid thinking that wins wars. They board a flight from Britain to Lisbon, Portugal, one of the few neutral countries with regular air service. From Lisbon, they fly to the United States, finally landing in New York. The journey takes days, multiple flights, multiple stops, constant anxiety that something will go wrong. But they make it, both of them, with their luggage, with their samples, and yes, with spores embedded in their clothing, just in case. They immediately traveled to Peoria, Illinois, to meet with researchers at the USDA facility. They share everything: their methods, their data, their cultures. And those cultures, those precious mold strains, become the foundation of American penicillin research. The spores in their clothes are never needed, but the fact that they were there, that these scientists were so committed to the mission that they literally wore their work across the ocean, that tells you everything about how high the stakes were. This wasn't academic research. This was a race against death on a global scale. The collaboration between British and American researchers, sparked by Flory and Heatley's risky wartime flight, becomes one of the most successful scientific partnerships in history. Within months, American pharmaceutical companies are building fermentation facilities. Within a year, they are producing penicillin in quantities the British could never have managed alone. By D-Day, in June 1944, there is enough penicillin to treat Allied casualties on the beaches of Normandy. Soldiers who would have died from infected wounds survive. The infection mortality rate drops dramatically. Some military historians argue that penicillin gave the Allies a significant strategic advantage. Wounded soldiers could return to duty faster. Fewer casualties meant more experienced troops. Higher survival rates boosted morale. And all of it traces back, at least partially, to two scientists who were willing to risk flying across a war-torn ocean with their most precious research hidden in their coat linings. The image is almost absurd. World-changing science, carried in pockets and seams, worn on bodies, betting that fabric and spores would survive what humans might not. But that is what desperation looks like in the pursuit of something bigger than yourself. They didn't know if it would work. They didn't know if they would even make it to America. But they had to try. And those inconspicuous flecks of mold, smuggled in coat linings across the Atlantic, helped seed the program that would eventually supply penicillin to millions. Sometimes, the most important things we carry aren't in suitcases. Sometimes they are woven into what we wear. Invisible but essential. Riding along just in case the impossible becomes necessary. Chapter 7. The Decade Nobody Cared. Here is something that should bother you. Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1929. That is the official date. He published his observations. He showed that penicillium mold produced a substance that killed bacteria. But penicillin didn't become a medical miracle until the early 1940s. That is more than a decade later. So what happened in those 10 years? Why did one of the most important medical discoveries in human history just sit there, ignored? The answer is complicated, frustrating, and very human. Fleming's 1929 paper described what he had observed. His petri dish had been contaminated with mold. That mold killed the bacteria around it. He extracted the mold juice, as he called it, and tested it on other bacteria. It worked. But then came the problems. Fleming couldn't purify penicillin. The substance was incredibly unstable. It degraded within days, sometimes hours. Different extraction methods gave wildly different results. He couldn't consistently reproduce his findings. He tried treating animals with penicillin. It didn't work reliably. Either he couldn't make enough, or it degraded before he could use it, or the animals' immune systems complicated the results. And crucially, Fleming wasn't a chemist. He was a bacteriologist. He didn't have the expertise to solve the purification problems. He needed help, but he couldn't convince anyone that this was worth investing time in. The scientific community looked at his paper and essentially shrugged. Interesting observation, they said, but probably not practical, probably too unstable to ever become a real drug. Lab antiseptics already existed. Topical treatments existed. The idea of a systemic antibacterial drug, something you could inject into the bloodstream that would hunt down bacteria throughout the body without killing the patient, seemed like science fiction. So Fleming's mold juice was filed away as a curiosity, something to mention in lectures maybe, an interesting phenomenon without practical application. Fleming himself moved on to other projects. He had spent years working on lysozyme, another antibacterial substance found in tears and mucus. He went back to that. He wrote papers about other topics. He didn't abandon penicillin entirely, but he stopped actively pursuing it. For nearly 10 years, penicillin existed only as a footnote in Fleming's career. Then in 1938, everything changed. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain at Oxford were looking for new research projects. Chain was doing literature reviews, reading old papers, seeing if there were any forgotten observations worth revisiting. He came across Fleming's 1929 paper, and something about it intrigued him. Here was a natural antibacterial substance. Yes, it was unstable. Yes, it was difficult to work with. But what if those problems were solvable? Chain was a biochemist. Florey was a pathologist. Together, they had the expertise Fleming lacked. They had access to better equipment, better techniques, a bigger team. They decided to rediscover penicillin. They started from scratch, grew their own mold cultures, developed new purification methods, tested on animals, and slowly, painstakingly, they solved the problems Fleming couldn't. By 1940, they had something stable enough to test. By 1941, they were treating Albert Alexander. But here is the haunting part. How many people died during that lost decade? How many soldiers in World War I could have been saved if penicillin had been developed just a few years earlier? How many mothers died from childbed fever in the 1930s? How many children died from strep throat, ear infections, scarlet fever? Millions. Tens of millions probably. All because Fleming's discovery sat on a shelf, ignored, considered too difficult to pursue. It is not really anyone's fault. Fleming did what he could with the resources he had. The scientific community made reasonable judgments based on the information available. Florey and Chain couldn't have started their work any earlier because they were busy with other projects. But still, the tragedy of timing haunts this story. What if Fleming had been a better chemist? What if he had had more funding? What if someone had taken his paper seriously in 1930 instead of 1938? How many lives would have been saved? We will never know. What we do know is that sometimes the most important discoveries don't announce themselves with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes they are quiet observations that almost no one notices. And sometimes the gap between discovery and implementation is filled with preventable deaths, with missed opportunities, with the cruel randomness of timing. Fleming discovered penicillin in 1929, but penicillin didn't save its first life until 1941. Those 12 years between observation and application, they are a graveyard we will never be able to count. Chapter 8. The Mouse Experiment That Almost Failed. Let's go back to May 1940. Oxford, Howard Florey's laboratory. The team has been working on penicillin for over a year now. They have solved some of the purification problems. They have something that is stable enough, pure enough, to test, but they haven't tested it on animals yet. They don't know if it actually works in living creatures. They don't know if it is safe. They decide to run an experiment. A simple, elegant, and absolutely critical test. Take 8 mice. Infect all of them with a lethal dose of Streptococcus bacteria, the kind that causes blood poisoning. Give 4 of them penicillin injections. Give the other 4 nothing. If penicillin works, the treated mice should survive. The untreated mice should die. Simple, straightforward, the kind of experiment that would either prove or disprove everything they had been working toward. They prepare the mice. They prepare the bacterial cultures. They prepare the penicillin doses. And then they hit a problem. They don't have enough penicillin. Remember, even by 1940, production is still microscopic. They are still using bedpans and milk churns. They are still getting tiny amounts from gallons of culture. And now they have to make a choice. Option 1. Give all 8 mice a small dose of penicillin. This would let them test more animals, get more data, but the dose might be too small to be effective. Option 2. Give only 4 mice a strong dose. This means half the animals won't be treated at all, but the ones that are treated will get a dose large enough to actually work. It is a gamble. Science loves large sample sizes. More data points mean more statistical confidence. Testing 8 mice is better than testing 4, but a weak dose that doesn't work tells them nothing useful. Flory makes the call. High dose, 4 mice, all or nothing. They inject 4 mice with penicillin. The other 4 get nothing. Then they wait. The infection works fast. Within hours, the mice start showing symptoms: lethargy, labored breathing, signs of systemic infection. The researchers watch through the day, peruse into the evening. The mice are definitely sick. By midnight, the untreated mice are clearly dying. Flory and his team stay up, monitoring. This is too important to miss. By 3:30 in the morning, all 4 untreated mice are dead. Blood poisoning killed them in less than 24 hours. It is a devastating infection. Exactly what they expected. But the 4 treated mice, they are still moving, still breathing, still alive. Flory later said that when he saw those 4 mice scurrying around in their cage while their untreated companions lay dead, he knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. He called it a miracle. But the experiment wasn't over. They continued monitoring, and over the next few days, one of the treated mice died anyway, probably from underdosing. Probably just not quite enough penicillin to completely clear the infection. But 3 survived. 3 mice that should have died, that would have died, lived because of penicillin. It is such a small thing, right? 3 mice, laboratory animals, not even humans. But this experiment changed everything, because now they had proof. Unambiguous, replicable proof that penicillin could save lives infected with lethal bacteria. Now they could approach ethics committees about human trials. Now they could seek funding. Now they could justify scaling up production. But here is the scary part. This experiment almost didn't happen the way it did. What if Flory had chosen the cautious route? What if he had given all 8 mice the smaller dose? The dose might have been too weak. All 8 mice might have died, and the team would have concluded that penicillin doesn't work in living animals. They might have given up, moved on to other projects, and penicillin might have remained a failed experiment. The entire future of antibiotics hung on that one decision to gamble on higher doses for fewer animals. Science celebrates careful methodology, large sample sizes, conservative approaches, and rightly so. But sometimes, the breakthrough comes from taking a calculated risk. Flory's gamble on 4 mice with high doses instead of 8 mice with weak doses saved billions of lives downstream. Those 3 surviving mice weren't just laboratory animals. They were proof of concept. They were the gate that opened the door to everything that followed. Every person who has ever been saved by antibiotics owes a debt to the decision made in an Oxford laboratory in May 1940 to bet everything on 4 mice, and to the fact that 3 of them made it through the night. Chapter 9. The Myth of the Messy Lab. Okay, let's talk about Alexander Fleming's discovery, the one everyone thinks they know. Here is the story you have probably heard. Fleming was a sloppy scientist. He went on vacation in the summer of 1928, left dirty petri dishes piled up in his laboratory, and when he returned, one of them was contaminated with mold that had killed the bacteria around it. Lucky accident. Serendipity. The messy genius who stumbles into greatness. It is a great story. It is cinematic. It is easy to teach. It is also probably not true, or at least not the whole truth. Recent analysis of Fleming's laboratory notebooks, interviews with people who knew him, and careful examination of the circumstances suggests something different. Fleming wasn't sloppy. He was methodical, careful, even obsessive about his experiments. And his discovery of penicillin might not have been an accident at all. Let's look at the evidence. First, Fleming had been obsessed with antibacterial substances for years before 1928. He had discovered lysozyme in 1922, an enzyme in tears and saliva that kills certain bacteria. He had spent years studying it, writing papers about it, trying to understand how natural substances fight infection. By 1928, Fleming was actively looking for other antibacterial substances. It was his thing, his specialty. He was always testing different compounds, different organisms, different combinations. Second, Fleming had a collection of molds and bacteria. He didn't just randomly encounter them, he cultivated them, studied them, kept them on hand for experiments. Third, and this is crucial, there are notes suggesting that Fleming deliberately placed molds and bacteria together using what he called a reverse sequence method. Normally, you would grow bacteria first, then see if anything kills them. But Fleming tried the opposite. He would grow mold first and let it establish itself, then add bacteria to see if they could grow near it. This technique is important because it suggests intention, not accident. If you are just leaving dirty dishes around, contamination is random. But if you are deliberately testing whether molds inhibit bacteria, that is experimental design. So why did the lucky accident story become the accepted narrative? Because it is romantic. Because people love the idea of genius stumbling into discovery. Because it makes science seem accessible. Like anyone could find the next penicillin if they are just messy enough. And Fleming himself didn't really fight the narrative. He gave interviews. He told the vacation story. He let the myth build. Maybe because it was easier than explaining the nuances of reverse sequence testing and systematic investigation of antimicrobial substances. Maybe because the lucky accident story made him more famous, more relatable. Maybe because even he wasn't entirely sure what had happened in that moment, and the simplified version was close enough. But the people who study the history carefully, who read the laboratory notebooks, who understand the context, they see a different picture. They see a scientist who had spent years investigating antibacterial substances, who had the knowledge and tools to recognize something important when it appeared, who deliberately designed experiments to find exactly what he found. That doesn't mean there was no luck involved. The specific Penicillium strain that contaminated his plate was unusually good at producing penicillin. That was fortunate. The fact that he noticed it, that he didn't just throw away the contaminated plate, that required observation skills and experience. But it wasn't a complete accident. It was prepared observation. It was luck meeting expertise. Louis Pasteur famously said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." Fleming's mind was extremely prepared. He had been preparing for years. So yes, there was a contaminated petri dish. Yes, there was mold that killed bacteria. But no, it probably wasn't just a sloppy scientist getting lucky. It was a dedicated researcher finding exactly what he had been looking for, using methods he had carefully developed in an area he had spent his career studying. The messy lab myth survives because it is a better story for classrooms and textbooks. But the truth is actually more inspiring, because the truth is that Fleming earned his discovery. He worked for it. He prepared for it. And when the moment came, he recognized what he was seeing because he had trained himself to see it. Penicillin wasn't found by accident. It was found by someone who spent his career learning how to find it. Chapter 10. The Quiet Weapon. Let's fast forward to 1944. World War II is in full swing. The Allies are preparing for D-Day, the invasion of Normandy that will open the Western Front. By this point, penicillin production has been scaled up dramatically. The collaboration between British researchers and American pharmaceutical companies has borne fruit. Fermentation tanks are running 24/7. Penicillin is being produced not in bedpans, but in industrial quantities, and every gram of it is going to the military. The U.S. War Department has classified penicillin as a strategic resource, not just a medicine, a weapon. In the hierarchy of wartime priorities, penicillin research and production ranks just behind the Manhattan Project. Yes, the atomic bomb program. Think about that. The government considers antibiotics almost as important as nuclear weapons. Because they are. Here is what penicillin does for the military that changes everything. Wounded soldiers on the battlefield face a huge risk, not just from the initial injury, but from infection, a bullet wound, shrapnel damage, even a broken bone from blast concussion. All can become infected. In previous wars, World War I, for example, infected wounds killed as many soldiers as the wounds themselves. Gangrene, blood poisoning, sepsis, these killed thousands. Survival rates for serious battlefield wounds in World War I were terrible. Amputation was often the only option, and even that frequently led to death from infection. But with penicillin, everything changes. A soldier wounded in Normandy in June 1944 would be treated with penicillin almost immediately. Medics carried it. Field hospitals stocked it. It was prioritized above almost everything else. Infection rates plummeted. Mortality from infected wounds dropped by over 80%. Soldiers who would have died instead survived. Soldiers who would have needed amputation instead kept their limbs. And here is the strategic advantage. Those soldiers could return to combat. A soldier who dies is a permanent loss. A soldier who is permanently disabled is a permanent loss. But a soldier who recovers from wounds and returns to duty, that is a recovered asset. Penicillin didn't just save individual lives. It maintained fighting strength. Experienced soldiers are valuable. They know how to fight. They boost unit morale. They train new recruits. Keeping them alive and functional gives a massive military advantage. The Germans and Axis powers didn't have comparable antibiotics. They had sulfa drugs, which helped somewhat, but nothing like penicillin. Allied soldiers had a significantly better chance of surviving wounds than their enemies, and everyone knew it. There are reports of captured German officers asking about the miracle drug they had heard rumors about. They wanted it for their own wounded. They didn't have it. The psychological impact was real. Allied troops knew they had better medical support. That knowledge affects decision-making, risk-taking, morale. But penicillin did something else too, something less talked about. It treated venereal diseases, soldiers being soldiers. Sometimes contracted syphilis and gonorrhea. Before penicillin, these diseases could take soldiers out of action for weeks, months, even permanently. With penicillin, treatment time dropped to days. A soldier with syphilis could be treated and returned to duty quickly. The military didn't advertise this publicly. It wasn't good PR. But internally, they absolutely tracked it. They knew penicillin was keeping troops battle-ready, not just from battlefield wounds, but from other infections too. By 1945, penicillin production had reached levels that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. The United States alone was producing millions of units per month, and every bit of it was tightly controlled. Pharmaceutical companies couldn't sell it to civilians. Doctors couldn't prescribe it freely. The military got it all. Some historians argue that penicillin's impact on World War II has been underappreciated. The atomic bomb gets all the attention. It ended the war with Japan. It is dramatic, visible, terrifying. But penicillin? Penicillin worked quietly, in field hospitals, in medical tents, in evacuation ships. No mushroom clouds, no dramatic photographs. Just thousands of soldiers living instead of dying, returning instead of being buried. Just a sustained advantage that accumulated over months and years. The Allies didn't just win because they had more soldiers, more tanks, more planes. They won because their soldiers survived wounds better, fought longer, recovered faster. Penicillin gave the Allied forces a biological advantage in a war where every advantage mattered. And after the war, when penicillin production finally opened to civilian use, the infrastructure was already there. The manufacturing process was perfected. The supply chains were established. Within a few years, anyone with a bacterial infection could get penicillin. The miracle that saved soldiers became the miracle that saved everyone. But it started as a weapon, a quiet weapon, one that didn't destroy enemies, but preserved friends. One that won battles not with explosions, but with survival. By saving lives rather than taking them, penicillin changed warfare itself and changed the world that followed. So there you have it. 10 stories about penicillin that go beyond the textbook version. The recycled urine, the burning injections, the woman who became a symbol, the improvised equipment, the moldy cantaloupe, the secret crossing, the forgotten decade, The mouse experiment, the myth of the messy lab, and the quiet weapon that changed warfare. Penicillin's story is about desperation and innovation, about scientists who improvised equipment from bedpans because they didn't have proper flasks, about a woman who looked at moldy fruit and saw potential, about researchers who wore their work in their coat linings across an ocean, about soldiers whose lives were saved by something grown in fermentation tanks. It is about timing, about the tragic gap between discovery and application, about how many people died waiting for someone to take Fleming's observation seriously. It is about sacrifice, about patients who endured injections that felt like fire because death was worse, about the police constable whose recycled treatment proved penicillin worked, even as he died from lack of supply. And it is about how something as humble as mold, something we usually throw away in disgust, can become one of the most important substances in human history. Every time you take antibiotics today, every time you or someone you love survives an infection that would have been fatal in 1940, you are benefiting from the work of people who believed in something impossible. They believed that mold could save lives. They believed that impure, contaminated, painful treatments were better than death. They believed that systematic searching would find a better strain. They believed that taking enormous risks to cross oceans in wartime was worth it. They believed that giving up wasn't an option, even when the problems seemed insurmountable. And they were right. Before penicillin, a scratch from a rose thorn could kill you. An ear infection could be fatal. Childbirth was a lottery with death. After penicillin, these became inconveniences, treatable, survivable. We live in a post-penicillin world now. We are so used to antibiotics that we sometimes forget what a miracle they are. But every once in a while, it is worth remembering, worth thinking about Albert Alexander, recycling his own medicine until it ran out, about Ann Miller, pulled back from death's door by an emergency diversion of military supplies, about Mary Hunt and her cantaloupe, about Florey and Heatley and their coat linings full of spores. These weren't gods or superheroes. They were ordinary people solving impossible problems with whatever they had available. And they changed everything. So next time you open a bottle of antibiotics, maybe take a second to appreciate the journey. From a contaminated petri dish in 1928, through a decade of neglect, through desperate improvisation in bedpans and milk churns, through a woman collecting moldy fruit, through scientists risking their lives in wartime, through mouse experiments that almost failed, through burning injections and recycled urine, to the pharmacy shelf where you picked up your prescription. That is the story of penicillin, and it is remarkable. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hit that like button, subscribe for more content like this, and let me know in the comments what historical topic you would like me to cover next. Until next time, stay curious and maybe look at mold a little differently from now on, because you never know what miracles might be growing in the strangest places.